Hi, this is Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. Thanks for joining me for this week's episode of the SonicScoop podcast. And today we're going to be giving you the three insights, my three key takeaways from an excellent MixCon masterclass that just went down with one Mr. Brian Vibberts. If you don't know Brian Vibberts, he is a 7-time Grammy winner. That is pretty impressive in my book. He's actually worked on many more Grammy-winning projects than that, starting as a runner, as an assistant back in the day, and then as an engineer, a mixer, producer. He's worked with Michael Jackson and Mariah Carey and Green Day and Metallica and Billie Eilish and so many others, too many names to count. And he actually probably gave us the most in-depth and detailed MixCon presentation we've ever had. It's about 2 hours long, and it's worth every minute. But in case you want a short Cliff Notes version of some of the key takeaways there, I'm going to give them to you right now. Let's get right into it before we do the quickest of shout-outs to this week's sponsors on the podcast. Number one being Antelopeaudio, because they sponsored the presentation from Mr. Brian Vibberts. And I'm actually talking to an Antelopeaudio microphone right now. This is the Axino. It is the most affordable standalone modeling microphone on the market. One of the very few standalone modeling mics in the market. Right now, I'm talking into a Neumann M103 recreation and a Summit Audio TLA 100A emulation for the compressor, but it's got an RE20 in there and a U87 and a Shure SM7B and so many other things. And they all sound pretty good. In fact, when I was talking to Brian, he was able to pick out the mic model that I was using without even hearing. He's like, oh, that's one of those Neumann M series. I'm like, how did you know? So he's got good ears, and apparently the mic models are pretty darn good too, if he's able to pick it out sight unseen. Also, big shout out and thanks to SoundToys sponsoring this podcast from the beginning. Try out anything they make for free for 30 days over at soundtoys.com, making some of my favorite creative mixing effects in the known universe. Last, certainly not least, FabFilter sponsoring this month. Check them out over at fabfilter.com, where you can try out all of their stuff for free as well. All right, without further ado, let's get right into it. My key takeaway number one from Brian Vibberts. There is so much overlap between what I heard from Brian in this presentation and what I've heard from so many of the other great mixers we've had at MixCon. And one of these first things is something that I heard in a presentation from Michael Brower. I heard in a presentation from Jeff Ellis. I've heard again, and that is that Brian's first and most important job in mixing isn't to make things sound better. That sounds kind of weird, right? That's what we think about mixing being the most important thing. But for him, that's not thing number one. It's closer to thing number two. Thing number one is enhancing the emotional impact of the song. And the decisions he's making are focused primarily around that. It's about following the narrative arc of the lyric, about following the emotional arc of the song and the arrangement, first and foremost, even ahead of enhancing the sonic impact of the song. And enhancing the sonic impact of the song does happen. And in a way, it's a byproduct of that first focus. And in a way, it's a separate process. But just having that in your mind as we're not trying to impress other audio engineers with a kick drum, we're trying to make the song feel better to the end listener. We're helping them connect with the lyric, connect with the emotion, the mood, whatever we're trying to conjure out of the end listener, and bringing more of that out of them and out of the track. So I think that's a big thing, and we've heard that with a lot of the biggest mixers. And this brings me to takeaway number 1.5, which is one of the key ways he does that is with automation, which is something I can't recommend enough. It's one of those things that takes you from being a good enough mixer to starting to be a great mixer, is knowing how, when, and why to use automation, not only to even out things on a technical level or a sonic level, but to enhance emotional impact and make sure the listener's attention is going to the right places. And he does that just as I'd recommend, first getting a good mix without any automation. He actually gets pretty much his instrumental mix going first, then brings in the vocal, and then starts in working with automation once that basic skeleton is there. And it's a super essential part of his process, super essential part of enhancing the emotion of the track. Now, this brings me into thing number two, where I talked about there's so many similarities he has with other producers and engineers. I can go on and on about other similarities, and maybe I'll bring up a couple more, but there's also some big differences. One of the things I've observed a lot in people who have made the transition to digital in-the-box mixing is a lot of them are very bus-focused. They'll do a significant amount of processing on their mix bus, and they'll often do a significant amount of processing on their sub-instrument group buses. So rather than just doing a ton of EQ on each guitar or on each individual drum. They might do a lot of, say, compression and maybe to some degree EQ on a bus that all of those instruments of the same group would feed to. And Brian doesn't really do either of those things. He doesn't use pretty much any mix bus processing. There's a little bit of limiter there so that he can bring up the level just for client reference, but he's not really doing mix bus compression, EQ, too much of that stuff. And he's not doing too much individual bus processing. He's doing a lot more processing on individual tracks and parallel treatments. And he does a lot of really cool parallel treatments here. Parallel vocals and kind of distorting them, parallel basses and, treating them separately and those kinds of things. So you find a lot of parallel processing. You find a lot of individual track processing. But in his style, not too much bus processing. And the point here being, big takeaway number 2, is there are so many different ways you can get to great results while mixing. And just because one particular person's approach sounds like it should make sense doesn't necessarily mean it's the best approach for you. Just because there's some other approach that a lot of people are doing doesn't mean it's necessarily the right approach for you. And Brian is very familiar with other people's ways of working. He talked about, how Kevin Killen is known for starting with the vocal first in his mixes and doing a lot of bus processing. And, he talked about Mick Guzowski's way of working, which is very different than Kevin's. And he has yet still a different way that's different from either of theirs, where he's relying less on the bus processing. And ultimately, you got to find what works for you. You can try to copy people who you really love and want to emulate, but, ultimately it comes down to creating your own path. And he goes through things in a different way than I often recommend, say in my Mixing Breakthroughs course. He'll often go through kind of track by track, first doing drums, then bass, then guitars, and then finally getting to the vocals. And he's made that approach work for him for, a long time now. It's a slightly more old school, super large console way of working, but he's adapted that and made that work for him in the digital domain. The third big takeaway here I get from Brian is that he clearly really loves variety in tools, and he loves having fun with gear. And he really does. He spent a lot of time selecting exactly which interfaces and A to D converters he wanted to go with, antelopeaudio, exactly which summing bus he wanted to go with. I believe it was the Chandler stuff. And I think he demoed with one of his friends 18 different summing systems, doing kind of blind A/B testing to hear which ones they like the sound of the best. And he really nerds out and geeks out about, different plugins, and he uses a big variety of a lot of different plugins, including the Antelope audio effects and a whole bunch of others, Wave stuff, plugin align stuff, Sound Toy stuff. And you can tell that he really enjoys and has fun with gear. And for him, that seems to be a healthy relationship. As long as the gear is there as an inspiration to kind of keep you curious, keep you motivated, keep you trying things, he seems to have a good set of relationships and trade-offs with it, and he likes working with a lot of plugins. And this is, again, a totally different piece of advice than we've gotten from some of the other mixers in this series who like to just use a handful of things and keep on coming back to them. So that's another one of my key takeaways from him. There's so many more I could go into. I could go even further into that idea of enhancing things. One of the things that I love is when he's taking his initial notes, one of the main things he's looking for is which lyrical lines need to stand out some more. Which ones could we add some delay to? That's a very Michael Brower way of thinking and of working, of looking at one of his responsibilities of being little call outs and little flourishes that he could add to the vocal, because he knows that's something that the end listener is going to think is really important. He has an approach that's similar to the one that we saw Cohen Heldens do in his MixCon presentation from earlier this year, where when he comes to processing on individual tracks, he's really doing his correction first and then his enhancement. So he's going in and doing things like EQs that are subtractive and trying to notch things out and tighten things up and things like that. He's doing his corrective processing first, and then once he feels like he's really corrected his sound, then adding enhancement afterwards. And a lot of his most bold enhancement, a lot like we saw in Cohen Heldens' recent mix and MixCon, his most bold enhancement is often done in parallel processing, where he might push a vocal into distortion to it. It would sound terrible by itself, but he's folding in a little bit of that to give it a little bit more body, edge, and character in the context of a full mix. Well, I hope some of these ideas and insights were useful for you. Big thanks to Brian Vibberts. He goes into supreme detail in his MixCon masterclass, almost a full 2 hours where you can see practically every last little knob he twiddles inside the mix. It's a great sounding one, so definitely check that out. We'll link to it in the show notes below and here on screen. Remember, if that you want to enter to win thousands upon thousands of dollars worth of free gear, you can check that out at the MixCon Mega Giveaway at SonicScoop.com/MixCon giveaway. That's SonicScoop.com/MixCon giveaway to enter for your chance to win. Big thanks again to Antelope for sponsoring Brian's presentation and sending me this lovely Axino microphone, super affordable modeling microphone with all of the major mic models you'd ever want to check out, and some great add-on effects as well, compressors, preamps, EQs, all processed inside of the microphone to take the DSP load off your computer. You can even track with that processing. Big thanks also to Sound Toys, making some of my favorite creative mixing effects. Check them out, soundtoys.com, and FabFilter, making some of the most useful plugins out there. Check them out, fabfilter.com. If you want some more free stuff, we got tons more MixCon videos. We've also got the free workshop, The 5 Habits of Every Great Mixer, which you can check out at SonicScoop.com/mixhabits. That's SonicScoop.com/mixhabits, where we tie together the common threads that you'll find in all of the major mixers who have done all of the major MixCon presentations. We've also got a free primer to mastering for you. If you want to check that out over at Mastering 101, that's SonicScoop.com/mastering 101, where you can get a 40-minute primer on everything mastering, what it's about, how to do it, how to get started yourself, what to listen for, what kind of processors to use, and so on. Of course, you want to go deeper, we've always got the full-length courses, Mixing Breakthroughs with yours truly, now in its 2.0 iteration, and the full-length course on Mastering Demystified, where I tell you everything I know about mastering. Thanks for hanging out with me. This has been Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. See you next time.